Nearly 5 decades ago, a young woman was killed inside her own apartment in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, leaving behind her newly married husband and a neighborhood gripped by fear. Investigators questioned 300 individuals, put together a task force, brought in criminologists, but turned up no suspect and no real leads to follow. The case eventually stalled completely. Yet through all those decades, the single DNA sample recovered from the scene was never thrown away. It was preserved carefully across generations of detectives. Then, a genetic genealogist decided to try an approach nobody had attempted before, tracing a family line back 400 years to a tiny village in southern Italy. What she uncovered led straight to a man who had been living in Lancaster County for almost 50 years, in a way nobody could have predicted. Before we get further into this story, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And if you're enjoying this video, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss future cases. In 1975, the nation watched helicopters lifting off the roof of the embassy in Saigon amid chaos. Gerald Ford had recently signed the divisive pardon for Nixon, and television screens in countless American homes displayed footage of desperate crowds scaling the embassy walls in Vietnam. It was a year when the country felt exhausted, doubtful, and uncertain about what to trust. In Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, roughly 2 hours west of Philadelphia, Amish tobacco fields and cornfields sat right alongside apartment buildings. Lindy Sue Beechler, just 19, worked at a flower shop in the county. Long-haired with a soft smile, that's how those who knew her later remembered her. She was married to Philip Beechler. The couple made their home in the Spring Manor apartment complex on Claus Drive in Manor Township. It was an ordinary life the two of them were building, nothing extravagant, no lofty dreams, simply two young people setting up their future together in a modest apartment. On the afternoon of December 5, 1975, Lindy made a stop at the bank to deposit the couple's paycheck before heading out to buy groceries. She came back to the Spring Manor apartment carrying bags of food, set them down on the dining table, and never got around to unpacking them. Sometime between 6:45 and 9 o'clock that evening, inside the living room of that apartment, Lindy Sue Beechler was attacked. She resisted. She refused to give in. She fought with all the strength she had, but her attacker wielded 2 knives, one he brought with him and one taken straight from her own kitchen. She suffered 19 stab wounds to her neck, chest, stomach, and back. When her aunt and uncle stopped by that night to swap recipes, knocked, and stepped inside, they were met with a sight that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Lindy lay face up on the living room floor. A knife remained lodged in her neck. A dish towel had been wrapped deliberately around the handle, a calculated move to hide fingerprints, done by whoever committed the act. Police were notified right away that night. The scene bore obvious signs of a violent fight and a sexually motivated crime. A man's shoe print turned up in the kitchen. The autopsy confirmed that she died from massive blood loss, and evidence of sexual assault was verified. Defensive injuries on her hands and arms proved that Lindy had fought until the very end. Her death wasn't sudden or without resistance. This was a genuine struggle that played out in the living room of that small home. She never gave up. Detectives picked up on something important about the timing. The assault took place in a narrow gap between Lindy's arrival home and Phil's expected return, which suggested the killer wasn't some random stranger, but rather someone familiar with her routine, someone who understood she'd be alone at that hour and knew exactly when to find her by herself. Officers from Manor Township in Lancaster County began questioning her friends, the neighbors in the 4-unit building, and her co-workers at the flower shop. A task force was assembled. Outside criminologists were brought in to consult. Phil Beechler was interviewed as routine practice, as is done with any spouse of a victim, and he was ruled out. Nothing credible pointed to anyone within Lindy's social circle. The killer left behind no usable fingerprints. The shoe print in the kitchen went nowhere. And that dish towel wrapped around the knife handle, a deliberate act by someone composed enough to think about hiding evidence even in the middle of committing murder, revealed that this wasn't a person who'd lost control, but someone still level-headed enough to protect himself even as he killed. DNA was recovered from semen found on Lindy's underwear, the sole piece of physical evidence from the whole scene that came directly from her killer. Back in 1975, there was no way to analyze it beyond preserving it and waiting. Investigators logged it, sealed it carefully, tagged it, and put it into storage. They understood it was the single most critical piece of the case. What they didn't know was that it would take almost 50 years before that vital piece would finally reveal a name. In the months and years following the murder, Lancaster County investigators spoke with a total of 300 people, a figure that showed just how far the investigation reached, chasing down every possible thread, every person who knew Lindy, every regular at the flower shop, every resident of Spring Manor and the surrounding buildings. Outside criminologists were consulted. The crime scene was revisited again and again. Every small lead was chased down until it went cold, and then they'd search for another. But nothing ever led anywhere. Not one name surfaced from those 300 interviews as a real suspect. No evidence pointed clearly to any one person. No community tip led anywhere worth pursuing. The only real trace the killer left was that DNA sample, and in 1975, it was simply an item in storage with no practical use for the investigation at the time. Then came the 1990s, bringing exactly what Lancaster County detectives had been waiting for since that night in December of 1975. DNA testing started becoming part of the American legal system. For the first time in almost 20 years, the semen sample from the case file could actually serve as a genuine investigative tool. It was submitted to CODIS, the national database that holds DNA collected from people arrested and convicted throughout the country. The results came back with no matches. The killer had no criminal history, no police record, nothing that would place his DNA in any existing database. In 2019, the newly formed cold case unit within the Lancaster County District Attorney's Office decided to pursue a different route. They reached out to Parabon Nanolabs, asking them to use the crime scene DNA to generate a composite image, a prediction of what the suspect likely looked like at 25, the age he would have been at the time of the crime, built entirely from the genetic data in that sample. In September 2019, 2 images were shared publicly, accompanied by an appeal for information from residents of Lancaster County. Media outlets picked up the story. People took notice. And then, silence. No meaningful tips surfaced. No names emerged that led anywhere useful. The case stayed frozen. Time moved on. Lancaster County transformed. Fresh neighborhoods rose up where old fields once stood. New generations came of age never having heard the name Lindy Sue Beechler. Meanwhile, the Spring Manor apartment complex on Course Drive remained standing. Phil Beechler had been a 20-year-old who lost his wife within the first year of marriage, not to sickness, not to an accident, but through something no ordinary words could capture, and every passing year he aged with a question that never got answered. The file stayed technically open, marked as the longest-running unsolved case in the county's history, a distinction nobody wanted attached to their name. The DNA sample sat preserved in the lab, passed down through one generation of investigators after another, each inheriting it from the last and setting it aside with the same sense of powerlessness. 4 to 7 years, enough time for a baby born after Lindy's death to grow into adulthood and have children of their own. 4 to 7 years, and the killer remained right there in Lancaster County, living an ordinary life, growing older right alongside everyone else. In April 2018, the country turned its attention to a stunning arrest out in California. Joseph James DeAngelo, known as the Golden State Killer, responsible for at least 13 murders and more than 50 sexual assaults committed throughout the 70s and 80s, was finally captured after evading justice for over 4 decades, made possible by a groundbreaking method known as genetic genealogy. Rather than searching criminal databases for a suspect's own DNA, this method searched public genealogy databases for DNA belonging to relatives, then constructed family trees to zero in on a specific person. Lancaster County's cold case unit followed the Golden State Killer story closely, and by 2020, they contacted C.C. Moore, lead genetic genealogist at Parabon Nanolabs, a woman credited with helping crack hundreds of cold cases nationwide. The moment Moore reviewed the file, she realized this case was unlike anything she'd previously handled. In typical genetic genealogy work, investigators usually find DNA connections at the level of distant cousins or uncles, people linked through common ancestors just 2 or 3 generations removed, and from there build family trees to pinpoint someone specific. But with the Beechler case, the nearest matches anywhere in the public genealogy database were incredibly distant relatives, connected to the killer through ancestors from the 1600s or 1700s, 300 to 400 years back. Standard techniques simply wouldn't work here. Moore had to invent a completely new approach, mapping the family tree across centuries rather than decades, work she later called the toughest challenge of her career. After months of effort, she and her team pinpointed the one shared origin point connecting every DNA match in the database, their ancestors. No matter whether they now lived in Pennsylvania or elsewhere in the U.S., they all traced back to the same place, Gasparina, a small town in Calabria, in southern Italy. Starting from a lab in Lancaster County in 2020, the trail led backward to a 17th-century village in southern Italy, then forward again through generations of migration and settlement to determine which family from Gasparina had eventually settled in Lancaster County and left descendants still living there. Moore compared this against genealogical records of Lancaster County families with roots in Gasparina, a narrow, specific group with only a handful of eligible people. She then filtered further by age and gender, steadily ruling out names that didn't fit. The list narrowed down to just a few names, and among them was David Sinopoli. Sinopoli, 68, lived in East Hempfield Township, Lancaster County, not far at all from where Lindy Sue Beechler had been killed, a man who had called the same county home for the past 47 years. No criminal record. No police history. Nothing in nearly half a century that would have led any investigator or neighbor to connect him to the Spring Manor apartment or the 19-year-old woman murdered there. Investigators uncovered one more crucial fact. Back in 1975, Sinopoli had lived in that very same 4-unit building at Spring Manor, the identical building where Lindy and Phil resided, just steps from the victim. A neighbor whose face and name Lindy may well have recognized, someone she might have exchanged a nod with in the hallway. Not one tip in 47 years. His name had never once surfaced in any investigative file. Once Sinopoli's name showed up on CECE Moore's list, Lancaster County investigators held back from approaching him directly, knowing that doing so would tip him off, giving him a chance to prepare and stripping them of the one advantage they had, surprise. Instead, they began quiet, patient surveillance, careful not to reveal anything to anyone. They needed his DNA to verify Moore's findings, but lacked sufficient grounds for a court order, and asking outright would ruin everything. So they waited, tracking his daily habits, noting where he went, watching for the moment he'd discard something bearing his DNA. Voluntary DNA, the kind courts would actually accept as evidence. On February 11, 2022, David Sinopoli made his way to Philadelphia International Airport. He drank a cup of coffee, then tossed it in the trash. Investigators were watching, ready for that exact moment. They recovered the cup from the bin and sent it off for lab analysis. The test results came back a match. The DNA pulled from the coffee cup Sinopoli discarded at the Philadelphia airport aligned precisely with the semen DNA recovered from Lindy Sue Beechler's underwear decades earlier. The odds of a match, roughly 1 in 10 trillion. Blood traces on the same clothing further confirmed the finding. There was no space left for doubt. That discarded coffee cup at Philadelphia International Airport had finally brought an end to the decades David Sinopoli likely believed he'd carry to his grave. On July 17, 2022, Lancaster County investigators arrived at David Sinopoli's home in East Hempfield Township and took him into custody, 46 years, 7 months, and 12 days after Lindy Sue Beechler's murder. The following day, District Attorney Heather Adams appeared before reporters at the Lancaster County Courthouse to announce that the county's oldest cold case had finally been cracked. What shook the Lancaster County community wasn't that the suspect was famous or held any special status. It was something else entirely, something far heavier to sit with. The realization that for 47 straight years, not a single lead, tip, or investigator had ever pointed toward David Sinopoli. He had spent all those years living right there in Lancaster County, within arm's reach of everyone, simply growing older alongside the rest of them. At the press conference, Adams remarked, "This case was solved thanks to advances in DNA technology. To be honest, without that, I don't know if we would have ever solved it." Phil Beechler, the man who'd left home that morning on December 5, 1975 as a young husband and came back that night to a life completely upended, who had spent the next 47 years carrying a question with no answer, finally learned the identity of his wife's killer after nearly half a century. For the first time since that night, the man responsible had a face, an address, and had finally been caught. Following his arrest in July 2022, Sinopoli spent more than a year in jail awaiting trial. Enough time to reflect on what he'd done and ultimately choose not to fight the charges in court. There was no full trial, no jury, none of the extended back and forth of witnesses and opposing arguments. On October 19, 2023, David Sinopoli, then 69, appeared in the Lancaster County courtroom before Judge David Ashworth and pleaded guilty to 3 charges: third-degree murder, aggravated assault, and burglary. That day, Assistant District Attorney Christine Wilson placed a photograph of Lindy Sue Beechler right beside the defendant's chair, forcing Sinopoli to sit next to the image of the woman he'd killed nearly 50 years before. Wilson turned toward him, pointed straight at the photo, and said plainly that cases like this are never forgotten and that Lindy Sue would never be forgotten either, noting that while the defendant had gone on living his life, hers had been cut short by his hands. She urged him to look at the photo and reckon with the precious life he'd taken back in 1975. Sinopoli glanced at the image. His expression didn't change, no remorse, no visible emotion, nothing resembling what most would expect from someone confronting the face of the person they'd killed. Judge Ashworth stated that the level of harm caused was almost impossible to fully grasp, and that the cruelty behind the actions could not be overstated. He also pointed out that the guilty plea came only because Sinopoli had been caught, not out of remorse, not from a guilty conscience, not for any other reason. Phil Beechler rose in the courtroom, the man who'd lost his wife at just 20 years old, and spoke directly to Sinopoli, telling him he had stolen a massive piece of his life and inflicted unmeasurable pain on countless people, all while the killer himself got to go on living freely. When Judge Ashworth offered Sinopoli the chance to speak, he gave only a single line, an apology to everyone, including his own wife. He offered no explanation for entering that apartment, no reasoning behind the 19 stab wounds, not one word about what happened the night of December 5, 1975. The one question that Phil, Lindy's family, and everyone else in that courtroom desperately wanted answered, why, remained unanswered, and likely always will be. Judge Ashworth handed down the sentence outlined in the plea deal, 25 to 50 years in prison, the harshest penalty allowed for each individual charge under the Pennsylvania Criminal Code as it stood in 1975. In effect, Sinopoli was sentenced under the laws from the era when he committed the crime, not the era in which he was finally caught. He was also ordered to pay $25,210 to cover prosecution costs. At 69 years old, a 25 to 50-year term amounted to a life sentence in every practical sense. David Sinopoli would spend the remainder of his days behind bars and die in prison, while Phil Beechler and Lindy's family continued carrying the loss, with nothing able to undo it. Following the sentencing, District Attorney Heather Adams told reporters that justice had finally arrived for Lindy Sue Beechler, made possible by the tireless work of numerous law enforcement officers across multiple agencies over the years, and that the DNA evidence analyzed by Parabon had pinpointed her killer with certainty, resulting in what amounted to a fitting life sentence for the 69-year-old. Assistant District Attorney Wilson added that the defendant believed he'd escaped consequences while living freely for 48 years, but that the community's refusal to forget Lindy Sue, combined with relentless effort from many people over many years and breakthroughs in DNA technology, ultimately caught up with him. The Lindy Sue Beechler case didn't inspire a law bearing her name, spark a non-profit, or become the subject of a TV series, but within the community of professionals who solve cold cases through genetic genealogy, it occupies a unique place unlike any other case, precisely because it was the most difficult one ever cracked using this method. That very difficulty pushed investigators to pioneer an entirely new technique. C.E. Moore had to build a method that had never before existed, tracing a family tree back 4 centuries from a lab in Lancaster County all the way to a small 17th-century village in southern Italy, then tracking it forward again through generations of migration to isolate one single man. That method has since become a resource for tackling other cold cases once thought impossible to solve through genetic genealogy. That, ultimately, is the true legacy of the Lindy Sue Beechler case, one that leaves behind practical takeaways every American, particularly women living alone or in small apartment complexes, can apply to their everyday lives starting now. First, always lock your doors, even in a peaceful neighborhood, even when you know everyone around you, even if you're stepping out for just a short while. Back in 1975, Lancaster County was a place where hardly anyone bothered locking their doors because it didn't seem necessary, and that's precisely what allowed the killer to get inside. Second, stay cautious with people who share your building, not because every neighbor poses a threat, but because the most dangerous person is often the last one you'd ever suspect, the same face you greet every day without a second thought. Third, keep your loved ones informed of your schedule, not a vague "I'm heading to the store," but specifics, what time you're leaving, when you expect to return, and who to contact if you don't show up as planned. Nobody knew Lindy would be home by herself during that stretch of time, and the killer was counting on exactly that. Fourth, listen to your instincts. If someone in your building makes you uneasy for no obvious reason, that's not paranoia, that's your survival instinct doing its job. And finally, this story is a reminder that DNA never lies and never fades from memory. Even if it takes 47 years, justice can still catch up. Never assume a case is forgotten simply because it's gone cold. If you found value in this video, please hit subscribe and share it so stories like this keep getting told, because your share might be exactly what reminds someone out there to think about their own safety. Thanks for watching all the way through. See you in the next one.